Right about now, I have a lot of students requesting for tutoring to help them better understand the difference between classical conditioning, operant conditioning, learning in general. So I wanted to make a video about it, and I guarantee you that this video is going to clear it up once and for all. First of all, let's start with the umbrella term. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning are both under a term called associative learning. They're called associative learning because if you pull the term apart, it is a process by which we are associating two things together. We are pairing two things together, which will result in learning. Let's go with classical conditioning first because it's usually first introduced. I'm sure by now you've heard the story about Ivan Pavlov and how he did an experiment with dogs and bells, but what is it actually? I always find that since I'm a storyteller, if you understand like the origins of classical conditioning, it's going to help you better understand it. What is classical conditioning? Well, Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist. He didn't study psychology. He wasn't interested in psychology. At the time, Pavlov was a physiologist. He was studying at that time digestion. And he was using dogs to study digestion. He was most interested in the role of saliva in the function of digestion. Now, saliva is an automatic response to the introduction of food. So every time that you chew food, your salivary glands are going to secrete saliva. The reason why you do this is multifaceted. Number one, it is your body's very first line of defense for digesting any food that you eat. I mean, as you mash it into smaller pieces, you're going to coat all those small pieces in saliva, which is going to help it move through the digestive tract a lot better because you're a bunch of tiny little tubes all through here, so it helps the food move through. But it also has digestive enzymes in it already to begin with. So as soon as you mash up your food, salivating is done automatically to help you start breaking down that food. Now, it is so automatic, it's so biologically tied to a stimulus and response relationship. Like, you didn't have to learn how to do it. You didn't have to go to school to do it or read a book how to do it. Your body automatically does it to the introduction of food. And you can't control it any more than you can control when and how your stomach passes food off into your intestines. Very important to note that it is an automatic stimulus and response relationship. Automatic, biologically automatic. Pavlov had dogs inside of cages for his research, and he had surgically implanted test tubes onto the salivary glands of these dogs. So every time that he gave them food, the dogs would salivate and it would fill up these test tubes. Later, he would use the test tubes full of saliva to test them for the different compounds. One day, he found something very peculiar. He had forgotten something in his laboratory after he'd got home, shut off all the lights, the dogs are in their cages. So he had to return back to his lab to go get that thing that he forgot. As soon as he walked through the door, though, he had noticed that the dogs had stood up in their cages and they started filling up the test tubes full of saliva, which he thought was odd because the activation of your salivary glands, like actually having saliva in your mouth, is a response to food, a biological response to food. So why was it that they were starting to salivate as soon as he walked through the door? Now, if you have a dog, you know that this is not totally abnormal. When you first come home and see your dog is probably going to expect some food, might maybe get a little slobbery. But for that first time in his life, Pavlov was not taking it for granted. He looked at it and he was like, why though? Why? So I imagine that it's because like they are associating me, the introduction of me, my footsteps, my smell, whatever it is, with eventually being fed, and therefore their salivary glands are being activated. Fine. But how far can I take this? Like, how weird can I make the thing that is going to make if I'm going to make them salivate, what else can make them salivate? And can I teach them to salivate in response to something like totally out of left field? So this is where we're going to begin. We're going to begin with the automatic stimulus and response relationship between food and salivating. Now, as I said, this is a biological pairing, right? You have nothing to do with it. It is totally unlearned. You didn't read a book or go to school to learn how to do this. It's unlearned, unconditioned stimulus and response relationship. So we call it US and UR for unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response because we don't really say, in this instance, we don't say unlearned, we call it unconditioned. Now, Pavlov was like, how weird can I make this thing? And he could have chosen anything, right? He could have chosen like the sound of a car horn or a door slamming or a particular song. But in this instance, he chose a tiny little bell, the sound of a bell. The dogs had never been introduced to before. They had never heard it before, right? So he was like, if I can take this completely neutral in the relationship between food and salivating, this is a neutral thing, right? It's never even been in this laboratory before. So that is going to be our neutral stimulus, the sound of this bell. And so when he had rang this bell, he immediately gave the dogs food. And then the dog started to salivate. And then he rang the bell again, and then he immediately gave them food. Then they salivated. And then he rang the bell, and then he gave them food, and then they salivated. And he rang the bell and gave them food, and then the dogs salivated until one incredible moment, the moment of truth, when he rang the bell, but did not introduce any food to them. And what do you think happened? They salivated. The dogs actually salivated to the sound of the bell. This was the new stimulus and response relationship. It was no longer food causing salivation. So this bell is no longer neutral, and the salivating is no longer unlearned or unconditioned. This bell becomes our conditioned stimulus, S for stimulus, and the salivating becomes our conditioned response. This is the new stimulus and response relationship. Now, what happened next is he rang the bell again and didn't give them food, and the dogs salivated, and they were all celebrating, right? Like he was calling in friends from other labs next door. He was like, watch this. And he would like ring the bell, and then the dogs would salivate, and they're like, that's crazy. And he like FaceTimed his family, and he was like, guys, watch this. And he rang the bell, and the dogs salivated, and he did it over and over and over until eventually they rang the bell, and no salivating had occurred. The pairing had broke. The stimulus and response pairing had broke. The conditioning had broke. And in that moment is called extinction. When the conditioning is done, it's over. Let's talk about another story I'm sure you've heard. John Watson. John Watson was also in the field of classical conditioning. He didn't use dogs in his experiments. He used orphan children, which at that time was still okay for some reason. His most famous example is called Baby Albert, or Little Albert. So he had Albert in his laboratory, an infant, right? A baby. And the baby was like sitting in his laboratory, and Watson had brought out a fluffy bunny to introduce to the baby. And the baby's like, oh my God, it's hopping, it's fluffy, it's cute. This is amazing. Baby's living his best life right now. And then one time they brought the bunny out to introduce to Little Albert again. And Pavlov this time had made this very loud, sharp, piercing sound right behind the baby. It startled the baby. And the baby started to cry. And then they took the bunny away. And then they brought the bunny back out. Watson had made this large sound again, startled the baby, and then the baby cried. And then he repeated and repeated and repeated until eventually he brought the bunny out, and the bunny was starting to make the baby cry. So now your responsibility now, which is absolutely something that you may see on the AP exam, in this story, what was my unconditioned stimulus and my unconditioned response, and what was my neutral stimulus? Now, I always find it best, and here's my suggestion to you. Start with the response, the unconditioned response. In my story, in the story of Watson and baby Albert, what was the response, the eventual response that we were looking at, that we got from the baby? What was the response from the baby? Crying. Good. Now, as I said earlier with Pavlov and the dogs, we want to try to find what is like the biological automatic response here that is unlearned, unconditioned, 365 out of 365 days out of the year. The baby is always going to cry to this. What is it? Being startled, getting frightened, right? So I'll just write fear here. All right, so that is my unconditioned stimulus, my unconditioned response. No learning necessary. This is always going to happen to a baby every single day of its life, right? So then in this story, what is the neutral stimulus? What previously had nothing to do with fear or crying? The bunny, absolutely. So the bunny, at that point in time, was neutral to this initial biological relationship. Now, eventually, he had paired the bunny with the very loud sound so many times that the bunny eventually just made the baby cry. At that moment, that's called acquisition, because he did not have to make the sound anymore. The bunny was now making the baby cry. This is no longer a neutral stimulus. This becomes my conditioned stimulus. This is no longer the unconditioned response. This becomes my conditioned response. This is the new stimulus and response relationship. That's classical conditioning. That's classical conditioning. Very famously, you might know that Watson then later had introduced things like costume beard, a big white beard, and he had brought out other things like a white lab rat and a woman's white fur coat, and anything that was white and furry was making the baby cry at that time. And the fact that the baby was like sort of like spanning out, like globalizing the things that was making the baby cry is called generalization. Now, if he had brought out a golden retriever, that was not going to make the baby cry. If he brought in his son, that would not make the baby cry. So all of these things that are not going to make the baby cry, that don't fit the criteria, that's called discrimination. These things are discrimination. I'm going to mention this here because I feel like it's very, very important. At some point, the orphanage did call Watson and say, hey, we lent you a bunch of these orphans and you brought us back a bunch of children who have an extreme fear to anything with a white beard and a bunny, which means that Christmas is over with and Easter is ruined forever. Right? So they said, you have to come and do something about this. So he did. This is something that you're going to come across when you come to the unit on therapies, but this is where I like to introduce it because this is real. So he did go to the orphanage. He's like, I'm sorry, I'm going to help out the best way that I can. So Watson brought the bunny with him. And on one side of the room, he had little Albert. And on the other side of the room was Watson with the bunny behind his back. And Watson had pulled the bunny out from behind his back. And the baby saw the bunny and was like, whoa, 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 whoa. And little Albert stayed in that sort of state of shock and is everything okay? There's no sound. Okay. All right. And then the anxiety sort of calmed down. And then Watson put the bunny behind his back again and then took a step closer with the bunny and then pulled the bunny back out. And then little Albert was like, oh my God, 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 oh my God. Nothing occurred. Baby Albert was fine. Little Albert was fine. So Watson put the bunny back behind his back and took another step closer and then another step closer and another step closer and another step closer until eventually he could put the bunny back in the baby's lap and the baby was totally fine. This is a form of what's called exposure therapy. This type of exposure therapy is called systematic desensitization because he systematically was desensitizing little Albert to the bunny, the thing that was initiating little Albert's intense fear. And we still use systematic desensitization today. Imagine if you had an extreme phobia of heights, right? You come into my office and initially I make you stand on a stack of 3 or 5 books, right? And so you're a little up high and maybe you have a little bit of anxiety from it, but I hold your hand, we're going to get through this together and eventually you're going to be totally fine. And I do that with you until your anxiety is totally gone. And then I put you up on a step stool and your anxiety comes back, but I stay with you until the anxiety is totally gone. And then I put you on a high ladder and then the top of the stairs and then we go to the Empire State Building and all these sort of things. And that is still, exposure therapy is something that we still use today for helping people alleviate their extreme fears and phobias. Classical conditioning is different from operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is done with a series of rewards and punishments, but in psychology, we don't call them rewards, we call them reinforcements. And in my next video, I'm going to explain that even further.